our audience to please fill the front seats. Ladies and gentlemen, let's formally begin session number 7 on sustainable cities and urban regions. We have two technical presentations lined up for this technical session. One will be presented by Dr. Farooq Arif physically, and the other presentation is by Mr. Mohammad Tasi. He will be presenting his presentation online. Our first speaker is Dr. Farooq Arif. He is Associate Professor and Director, NED University Virtual Reality Center. Dr. Farooq's areas of research interest include automation, infrastructure management, risk analysis and management, augmented reality, building information modeling, legal affairs and dispute resolution in construction. He is member of PC Task Force on UN SDGs and member Executive Committee of UNESCO Chair on Sustainable Urban Regions. Today he will present Green Building Code Development and Learnings from Energy Efficiency Assessment. Please, Dr. Farooq, join the stage.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, Faiza, for the introduction, and thank you, audience, for being here. I'm going to discuss today the development of Green Building Code, which has been an exercise currently. Faiza, यार फोल्डर वाली प्रेजेंटेशन है, ये नहीं है, वो USB में आपको दी थी आपको मैंने. फायजा USB कॉपी करा दी थी, उनको बताओ एक दूसरी वाली चला रहे हैं. So basically the exercise is, if I give you the brief background of what is being done, at Pakistan Engineering Council, there is a committee who is working on development of Green Building Code. Committee is convened by Dr. Sarosh, and I myself is a member of it. But as a part of it, before that, we have worked on development of Green Building Code provisions for housing sector. So because whenever we talk about green buildings, we talk about, you can say, the certified green buildings. Typically in our mind, it's the case that we are talking about high-rise buildings. As far as the codes are concerned, the Energy Efficiency Code or Energy Efficient Building Code provisions were always there since 2011. But even those provisions cover up kind of high-rise buildings above 14 floors or around 14 floors. When it comes to housing sector, it's essential to understand the different dynamics. Not just because they are low-rise when we talk about houses, but also because the way they are constructed. So much of the housing sector is kind of partially formal, partially informal. And when you have to develop codes for such a sector, it becomes very difficult and challenging task. Usually when you talk about the code development recipe, it starts with the use of the established codes. But when we talk about housing sector, you cannot just go with a kind of recipe book, international recipe book, which we have been doing for long, and one of the participants also mentioned that earlier, yesterday during the panel discussion. So it cannot be superimposed. You have to realize what is being done and how the facilities are being used at the primary level. And according to those things, you have to develop the codal provisions. So basically, that kind of assessment needs a lot of R&D, a lot of realization of the social sector, how people behave, how people use, as I said, and how people live. So it also depends upon quality of life and their demands. So it's kind of it's the development of code for green housing or green building code for housing provisions require you to have a thinking process that incorporates not only technical dimensions, but also the social dimensions and economic dimensions of any particular country or any particular society. Pakistan being, if I may say, it's a conglomerate society when it comes to social fabric. We are bound with a number of things, but then if you talk about civil engineering to be specific and sustainable development in general, uh, there would be different requirements for different aspects within the country, considering the regions. As well as because of the kind of the social fabric, the acceptability of such provisions also is a challenge. Because you cannot impose something which is developed for, say, Karachi on somebody who is living in Khuzdar. They would have totally different dimension of how to live. How to, I'll just mention one key examples while they pull up the correct version of the presentation. That I was traveling to Khuzdar by the national highway. So in between the driver who was taking me there, I asked him that they were all just mountains, right? And in between that way, uh, I saw a number of houses constructed on the mountainous area. And I asked him that I want to explore this and why they kind of live in this house. So he told me about their social fabric. He said the people who live in these houses basically do not want to come down even. And that is why the design of their houses is accustomed to their lifestyle. So I asked them what kind of lifestyle do they have. They said they are not worried about, just like us, urban, if I may say, urban social animals, to earn more and to, they just are worried about they need to have open spaces, they need to have a shelter, and they think about their housing more from weather impact perspective. So they live in a dome kind of a, which from outside looks very beautiful, but they need open areas. And the earning resource usually is a couple of cattle, and they are happy with that. So if you want, and majority of the public in those areas living in the distance do the same. So how can you impose something that is not accustomed to their lifestyle? So it becomes very difficult, as I said, and challenging for a country like Pakistan, where we have number of different components of society, number of different social norms, number of different requirements to incorporate into codal requirements. And when we say code, it has to be code. It doesn't have to be guidelines. Usually we think about codes and guidelines being the same. If you go into the dictionary definition of the both as well, the codes are basically bound to be followed and regulated. And then the construction of the code, just like the documents construction, is such that it provides you or refers you within and outside the document with the code means some kind of ID, just like we have our CNIC ID, and those have to be relevant. And now if you pick up the codes in Pakistan, they are very well made, many of those, but then they become very difficult to follow. One realization that I found, and hopefully we can incorporate it into the Green Building Code as well, that if you talk about the code book, if it is so thick to follow, not easy to understand, then how would you follow it? So it would just open up, not at the time. Codes are supposed to be used at the time of designing, at the time of start of the conceptual phase of any construction project, not when you get stuck into something and then you open it up just like general conditions or special conditions of the contract. So it's totally different dynamics. And hence you need to have, I mean, just on a lighter note, I think sometimes that we need to have a code and then we need to have a supplementary book to understand that code, कि वो जो abridged version है. And that makes it difficult. So how can you follow in a professional life the designers and the architects and all of those who are involved to follow something which is so much detail, rightly so, but then becomes impractical to follow. Not just because of the thickness, but other aspects that I've mentioned in the requirement. So keeping in mind that, and I know that, as I understand, I think you don't have my presentation right now. So let me explain you without presentation, doesn't matter. Let's go to the old school style. Basically, we worked with European Union, EU, and there is a program, SCP facility, under their GIZ and Switch Asia. And they recently developed the, not just recently, last year they developed guidelines for the Naya Pakistan Housing Authority to develop green housing, because the idea was that when you are developing it from scratch and it's a regulated housing scheme, So you need to make sure that they are also accustomed to the SDG requirements, specifically from the green buildings perspective. So guidelines were developed in collaboration with UN Habitat. One of the program manager of UN Habitat was the speaker this morning in one of the sessions, Mr. Javed Ali Khan, and those guidelines were developed. But then the realization when the stakeholders sat together with regards to the guidelines was that, okay, guidelines are okay, but again, at the end of the day, they are guidelines. They may or may not be followed. And we are talking about something which is a structured housing scheme or housing program. So then we would lose another opportunity to make sure that what we are going to develop as a new thing would basically limit itself to, again, guidelines means segregated implementation. So the stakeholder decided to convert or to revamp and then come up with the guidelines for green building code provisions for Naya Pakistan housing scheme. Now, the way it was developed is something which is one of the key aspects of my talk today. The way those were developed had 3 different stages. And though that was designed initially by the project team to make sure that whatever I just mentioned at the initial stages of my talk, the loopholes or you can say the weaknesses in code development process could be covered up. So what we did, we decided to have 3-phase strategy. Those 3 phases included, number 1, the phase of developing a draft code by the old recipe. So the old recipe meant that we went through different literature, different international codes, different local codes that are already there under the auspices of Pakistan Engineering Council, and then look into what is currently related and not related as far as the scope is concerned. So you can say the scope defining of the document. And the scope defining, as I just mentioned about the social aspect, the environmental aspect, and other, we went on to finalize, or we went on to not finalize but conceptuate that, okay, when we talk about Pakistan's housing geography, we can, if we look at the different climatic zones, we would stuck in a big mess. I mean, you cannot have code for each UC or district. You have to have the code applicable to a general audience. Otherwise, it's not a code. Then we are again leaving it to people to follow whatever we do. So we basically looked into how geographically we can divide Pakistan into different climate zones. We went through the ASHRAE zoning. We tried to make a parallel between the weather that is here and maybe the ASHRAE, because that is the starting reference as far as the availability of climate zone. We involved climate zone experts to look into how can we integrate the climate zones, or how can we divide and develop the climate zone. We end up having that in general sense, there are basically 2 climate zones that exist in Pakistan. If you would ask some environmentalist, he may have a different view. But as far as the delivery of a construction or delivery of construction housing is concerned, there would be 2 climatic zones. Now those climatic zones are in parallel to what ASHRAE, for example, defines as climate zone 0 and 3. Because of the nature of the weather. And if you try to find out, you'll not get it over the internet very easily. You have to make parallels. We went through different softwares, different modeling softwares, and we tried to find out, okay, what kind of weather can be parallel. And then, as I said, we involved climate experts to verify that. And those 2 climate zones, the climate zone 1 we define as hot environment, generally speaking, and the second one is humid and mild environment, to be specific. Those are part of the document. The document is under review with the EU, with the Ministry of Climate Change, under whose umbrella these provisions have been developed and soon would be available online to everyone, and then there is implementation plan. So basically, according to those climate zones, we went through the different codes that are available, local, international codes, and drafted what we call as a 0 draft of the GBC. Now that 0 draft contained 5 aspects, and those are the minimum aspects that could be implemented as far as housing sector in Pakistan is concerned. Again, thinking about how structured it is and how non-structured it is, both components. So basically we had site sustainability aspect, we had water use efficiency aspect. I'm not talking about water management system, I'm talking about water use in buildings. And then, and this is a misconception as well, and I'll highlight that later on as well. And then third, we had indoor environment quality aspect. The fourth one, we had the energy efficiency aspect, materials aspect, and then waste management and recyclability. So these 6 dimensions basically cover up the whole house construction process. When I say house construction, again, we are talking about low-rise buildings, low-rise housing, or maybe just like the kind of apartments that we do have nowadays, in which they, on a housing plot, we do have 4 or 5 apartments, separated apartments, joint lease kind of thing available. Now, these aspects, again, we had to look into what is available with us. So, not much was available as far as specifically water use efficiency is concerned. Site sustainability, as well as you can say, and also waste management recycling. And whatever was available in energy efficiency was, as I said, to start with, was related to high rise, normally high rise. Even if you look into, for example, and I'm not being critical, but if you look into Pakistan Engineering Council's energy efficient building, energy efficiency provisions, energy provisions as they call it, of 2011, they were developed but implemented 2014. The real aspect of any construction, which is building envelope, just has a couple of pages. And the rest is all ASHRAE, and that ASHRAE, I think, if I remember correctly, is also 90.1. And it is a good document, but then ASHRAE 90.1 covers up the high-rise buildings. And it says, at that time, it was a good effort. But as you go deeper and you realize it, a lot of things have been done. So it is not as such accustomed to housing or even to high-rise, which I will talk about later on. Then the other thing was, when you talk about codes, and I see many eminent designers and architect and construction industry people here, the numbers that are there in the code are always, or typically the thresholds as we call them, might be coming from a reference document. Just if you think about it, it's easier to put that blame on something else. So we don't try to go into an exercise where we can at least verify those numbers, or at least if we can look around and have some experimented numbers and can incorporate. It would not change overnight. But then there is a lot of R&D being done. We talk about industry collaboration, R&D collaboration, academic collaboration, and then there is a lot of work which is untapped. And there are a lot of numbers associated with it. You need to verify those. So that was the problem. The other thing was, how much can we ask? So you see, when we can develop a wonderful document, it would look beautiful, it would be very thick, just like our university students, some of them are here, they start with submitting a very thick assignment thinking that the more the weight, the larger would be their numbers. But it's not the case with the code. You have to be realistic about what could be done. And code is not a stagnant document all the time. You need periodic revisions for that. So if you think about that, okay, let's put everything into whatever we know into the code, whether or not, and it would be a future provision or something like that. It would be something like you are eating 8 hours continuously in a day and realizing and thinking that I will be fine. So then when somebody would pick up that and try to use it, they would say these are just something which is imaginative only and not realistic. You have to be realistic. The code are not there for having it there in your bookshelf, but to implement. So we went around and looked for what numbers and what different data sets are available. And we tried to verify that. When I say we, it does not mean the team, the core team who were doing that. Because the second stage, once the draft was developed, was to go and get the stakeholder conformance. Now, usually the stakeholder conformance, if I talk about social sciences, the stakeholder conformance may be taken through questionnaires and every other thing. But when it comes to technical input, it could not be without spending a lot of time. And it's also not about how many people are conforming that, but more about who is conforming those things. So we looked around and developed a long list of 80 people, from not only from not only all of them were engineers, I mean from different sectors, owner organizations, regulatory bodies, everyone who can own those things. And we assembled them for a stakeholder workshop. That is a typical way. But this time around, we went with a different module. And this is something which I learned from an expert from Finland, whom we worked with for another aspect, where when you are to develop some policy recommendations, when you are to develop some codal requirements, you do not give anybody anything but get their mind into that at first. What we call as brainstorming. And decision making in decision sciences, there are many ways to get the brainstorming done. And this is actually decision making. So we went through, we asked them to come up with their own provisions, what they have done. Again, industry people most of the time, different stakeholder, what they have done in them. And we basically were able to confirm out of the 12 or 15 people who had done work in those areas, in the 6 dimensions, that what do they have in terms of, and they are top people considering the data set position. And also some of them had more regulatory grasp. So they basically put forward their own findings, their own, you can say research, or you can say their own experimentation. Then we joined them into a panel, and we went, because not all, then we asked the rest of the panelists. There was a big panel discussion exercise, and they basically went through and grilled everybody and asked different, and just like a panel discussion we had last night, but more rigorous than that because of the nature of the code development. And we got some good points from there. And thirdly, we divided everybody who was there, including the experts, including the partners and the stakeholders, into 6 different working groups. Now those working groups remain active beyond that day as well. So what they did was, based on the experimentation results, based whatever everyone had, and based on the draft code, they both were integrated and given a dimension through which they work with 2 things. One is to conform those provisions and to update those for the local conditions. Second is the implementation plan. The implementation plan was very important. EU, for example, says it as policy recommendation, but we asked them to, rather than having policy recommendation, we will develop an implementation plan. Implementation plan has some proposed things, but some of them are already understood things. I mean, if you pick up different things, when we talk about regulations, you take a lot of time to at first to realize कि जी कौन सी regulation किस authority के अंडर आती है. वो सिक्योरिटी में कहते हैं पुलिस वाला पहले थाना लगाता है कौन सा है. तो कोड में एक बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग टर्मिनोलॉजीज होती है AHJ, authority having jurisdiction. And again, just like any other thing, you write it down and then you just go away. So जिसको समझना है वो खुद समझेगा. So authority having jurisdiction is a common terminology or jargon that is used, but then we had to identify those as well. So that was our, okay, this is the terminology wherever applicable, but these are the authorities would have jurisdiction under different areas or on different areas. Second thing was, the part of the implementation code was and for which the stakeholders provided input as well, organizational structure. So at first we find out, do we need, I mean, when you talk about water, there will be different authorities. When you talk about, because at the code I will come at the last. I'm talking about the policy right now, but at the code, what we had in the code, I'll come at the last. So authority having jurisdiction was defined, and then later on the organizational structures, it was thought of, do we need a new organizational structure to implement that? And we realized that in parts, the different dimensions had different organizational structures available. And we need to reuse them. But then we need to develop a confederation of that organizational structure. I mean, rather than because nobody would like to have their jurisdiction touched upon, right? Nobody would be happy to do that. But at least we can have a confederation of those organizational structures defined within the implementation code. So whenever somebody picks up the code and looks at, okay, who would do that, they would have a guidebook, which is not again that thick, to look into that, okay, which organizational structure would be followed and which AHJ would be followed. The third thing was with respect to, and this is a proposal in that what kind of punitive damages could be implemented. Since in this particular exercise, the codal provisions are under the umbrella of one, Ministry of Climate Change, two, PEC, to get it, three, for a particular housing scheme or housing program. So it was possible to have those kind of minimum punitive damages recommended. I worked with another code I'll not name to review it, and it was being developed for Pakistan, and it was at that time, I'm not talking about housing code, but a different code, and at that time when it came to me for review from the authority, the relevant authority, it had to be presented in the parliament. And when I saw, there were damages of $7,000 in that document. So somebody just Control C and Control F and whatever you call it, and there were damages in $7,000. I said, this thing even does not cost, I mean, the worth is not $7,000, so you must have taken it from somewhere. This is just one example. And sooner or later we realize that we do have capacity, we do have designers, we do have architects, we do have regulators who can sit together and come up with their own code, the better it would be. Because otherwise we are wandering around in a desert. And wherever we would see that there is some oasis, we would run towards that, try to use it for a period of time and then come back. So it would never be a dynamic. Code is always dynamic in its implementation. So those three things were mainly defined. And finally, a recommendation process for future to incorporate specifically the green building aspect, but generally the sustainability into construction. All of this data set, which is authority, and this was worked around having the review of different regulations, but then conformed and updated through the stakeholder exercise. The third thing was, as I said, I'll come later, was the final version of the code. So I must credit that we used the provisions or you can say the baseline, the ASHRAE 90.2 in this case, which is for low-rise buildings, specifically for energy efficiency. We did use International Green Construction Code, with whom we inked an agreement to use their provisions and guidebook. And then we used a number of local studies from the local experts, of the data set of which was confirmed by the expert groups, the working group. Unfortunately, the presentation is not there, otherwise I'll show you all those pictures in the slides. And they assembled a good document. And at the end, as I've been talking about, these 6 aspects have been handsomely covered. I'm not saying completely covered, but handsomely covered, and include add complete with possible implementation into an only 45-page document. If you go through that 45-page document, you will realize that once it is available, you will realize that each one of the provisions, one way or the other, is applicable in one or the other climate zone. Now we are in a stage of getting it reviewed, expert peer reviewed, and after that, hopefully it would be available online. But the same provisions are going to be adopted most probably by the Pakistan Engineering Code as far as the low-rise buildings and these dimensions are concerned. Because we made sure that the experts who are working with the larger code, which includes the high-rise, which includes the low-rise, can incorporate this exercise. I'll give you example as part of my title as well, the energy efficiency aspect. Myself being involved in a number of R&D projects related to energy efficiency, and I give due credit to Higher Education Commission, Sindh Higher Education Commission, Ministry of Science and Technology. Then there are different partners to it with which we have been working over last 5-6 years to come up with some parameters of energy efficiency. These mainly include the assessment of building envelope. At first, we derived a comprehensive strategy by how can we make sure that energy, how can we assess the energy efficiency of a building or of a house. So the first thing was to have the assessment of already built houses, because it's difficult to change their building envelope. The new house could always be developed with creativity, innovativeness, and you can come up with something which you may like, even at a somebody else may not like. For example, I cannot change the orientation of an already built house, but what I can do is to use the existing orientation in a better manner. And that is what we did. So when we talk about building envelope, it includes fenestration, it includes the roof, it includes all kind of orientation related, the solar potential, the wind potential, and we developed a comprehensive instrumentation based energy audit strategy. Now this energy audit strategy, and luckily sometimes challenges give you some opportunities as well. When we were developing this and we were auditing pilot houses, unfortunately COVID came in. And in order to make sure that we get the right data, we had to visit the house for 2.5 hours, do some instrumentation, gather the data with respect to building envelope, and then analyze it in detail. But of course, people would not like even that in non-COVID time. But we identified 100 houses all around Karachi and different areas in the periphery of different categories who participated with us, and we developed an online audit strategy with which we trained the home user just by a dedicated mobile application, and they were able to get us the parameters. We modeled those houses. We did energy simulation of those houses by our own data. All the softwares and all the building information modeling softwares for specific use their libraries. We have to change the data set, say for example, the resistivity value, the conductivity or resistivity value, the orientation dimension, all of that was incorporated into those simulations. And we came up with what we call as energy use intensity in terms of energy in terms of cost. And then we went into what could be done better. While we were doing audits, the audit team, which were 4 teams, different teams, they were also asked to find out the opportunities that were there within the building envelope for improvement. And they did identify that. But then the simulation also gave us the consumption patterns, and opportunities were identified through that. Then we incorporated sensors which were dedicatedly developed for these projects, sensors that can measure the ambient aspect, that can measure the outdoor aspect, specifically what we are interested in thermal comfort in case of say our zone, which is climate zone 1 in that code, hot zone that comes into Karachi area. And we were able to, we installed in all spaces a set of 3-4 sensors that can give us multiple parameters, but the use mainly what we needed was the temperature, the relative humidity, the light intensity or directional light intensity. And those were analyzed against the Building Code of Pakistan provisions and the ASHRAE provisions to find out where we lack. And according to that, the opportunities were identified. These included an external assessment as well, in which case we installed a weather station on the top of the house and sensors inside the house to have the differential assessment. This is other than the audit. For a period of 15 days to 1 month in the peak temperature, that is typically from say March to till even nowadays to some part of September. And we found out the opportunity. We were able to define 10 major changes that could be done. Those 10 are divided into 3 categories. One is related to the building envelope, the other is related to the operating aspect, and the third is the renewable energy generation potential. When we talk about renewable energy, we think of electrical engineers, right? Rightly so. But when we talk about energy potential, this is an area of work which is done through this kind of assessment. So the potential mainly for solar and wind, and typically we found out the solar potential is more applicable in case of in Karachi and Pakistan in general than wind, because we have differential heights when it comes to the city landscape or city skyline rather. So the wind energy needs a lot of open area, a lot of other, and it is costly as well. But when it comes to solar, there is a tremendous potential as far as the solar energy potential generation is concerned, using the rooftop, which fortunately people have started realizing nowadays. Then there were some misconceptions about, we think about all the time that west open houses are always windy, right? It's not the case. It's from where you are looking at the west. So that is something which is not very commonly understood by people. If you go to a real estate agent, they would always say, okay, if you want a west open house, this is the additional price. But it's not necessary that that west open house would have the airflow of the kind as well. So that is, for some of you, might be a new thing as well. But the idea was to get into how the things are being used at the moment. An extension to that, wisely proposed by Dr. Rafiqi when I was discussing with, that we need to also think about the social dimension of that, how the people are using. For example, I sit in a room where there are 3 lighting fixtures, 2 fans, and I still run all of those without realizing that if I'm sitting alone, I might need only one. Then I go out of my room and because I'm lazy, because I don't want, so I don't turn off the lights and then come back. And how it can be assessed. So we are currently have designed a sensor system which can measure the occupancy versus the energy consumption. The only problem is if you want to get that installed into your house or not, because when you install sensors, comically people think they have cameras as well. It is not necessary. So if we can generate a pattern of energy use, then it could be used for further guidelines or codal requirements. You see nowadays you get a lot of ads and all those smart devices, but even if the smart device is there, and if you are able to use that smart device in a manual manner, I usually give example to my students that there was a provision of daylight saving that started in Pakistan few years back. And that is very, very, or even until it was very useful in my extent. But even in our friends and our family, we had people who had 2 watches, one with the old time and one with the new time. And whenever you talk to them, they know it's actually not 9 p.m., it's 8 p.m. And I went to, again, I went to some areas in Sindh and say Khuzdar. So once I went to Khuzdar and I went out at 7 o'clock in the evening. And I asked them who was accompanying me, I asked, everything is closed here. It's just, it's 7 o'clock. They said they come up at 7 in the morning and they have dinner at 7 in the evening. And that's the closure. We in Karachi, हमारा लाइफस्टाइल ऐसा है कि प्राउड नहीं है कि जब तक हम 1 बजे ना सो जाएं. मतलब हम लोग अच्छे लोगों में से नहीं है, या हम कह लीजिए पढ़े लिखे नहीं है अगर हम 1 बजे तक ना सो जाएं. So the idea is that the human factor is very, very important when it comes to use of energy. But can we just preach about it? No, we have to evaluate that. And that evaluation would come from this kind of system. So through that, we were able to identify different important parameters and codal, which were also incorporated, and some other studies. I'm giving you my study example. I don't know if Abbas Sajid Saver, if you talk to him, he said the biggest culprit of energy inefficiency in buildings, and rightly so, is the way we construct our roofs. Because 80% of the thermal incomfort, or at least 70% as per my research, comes from the roof, because it has a lot of steel, and when it is exposed, it consumes and the temperature rises. So then does it make RCC bad? No. We have to find other ways to make it. So at the moment we are working with and then 30 and 40% comes from the walls. We are working with, in those dimensions, developing a kind of thermal block that can give you thermal comfort in both weathers. Because it's a comic thing. My wife says, पहले हमने बिल्डिंग में खिड़कियां बनाई, फिर खिड़कियों में हमने पर्दे लगाए, फिर अब पर्दे लगा के पहले हमने खिड़कियां इसलिए बनाई थी कि एयर फ्लो हो, इंडोर एनवायरनमेंट क्वालिटी बेहतर हो, फिर हमने खिड़कियों पे शीशे लगा दिए, फिर हमने उस पर पर्दे लगा दिए. तो वी आर कंफ्यूज्ड, आई थिंक, इन दैट सेंस. सो देयर आर डिफरेंट कॉमन सेंस रीजंस that need to be updated as far as number 1 the design is concerned, and number 2 the use is concerned. So in future, as a part of future recommendation, there would be someday, not very far future, there would be someday of a code or a guideline of how to use a facility. It's all about not designing, but how to use it in operational field. And that covers up the whole document. Uh, I hope that I was able to make you visualize, because that is my work, being a teacher. If I'm unfair. It was a good challenge, but not to have the slides for once. But the bad thing is I spent a lot of time to develop those. So in any ways, I hope you liked, and if you have any questions, I'll be very willing to answer. And if you want to know more, we have a small startup called Building Energy Efficiency Simulator at NAD University, which does these kind of all stuff and have been doing it for a period of time when it comes to specifically low-rise buildings or low-rise housing. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and I'll be very willing to answer the questions. Thank you. Mike, I can repeat if the, yes.
If you can, hello,
Ji.
if you can also create a working manual along with the code, which is not necessarily part of the code, but it provides the required, shall we say, clarity, motivation, working details, which would be useful for an owner who's building, let's say, a low-rise building. Now, if you say that I want an R30 value in the walls or the roof, if that manual says this is what happens when you put in R30, this is the amount of savings you will incur, it'll motivate him. If there is some working on how it's to be inculcated into the composite roof structure, that will help him. So I'm just positing an idea to you that if you can make also simultaneously a working manual, and usually for all codes, there are independent authors that I've seen who do make these working manuals to clarify the code and so on and so forth, so somebody could work in that direction. The other thing you talked about is the review of the code. And while you did go along with the Finland idea, and I'm sorry I walked in late and I walked in while your presentation was already on, but one good way of getting review from the public at large is to put it on the net for review for a period of time and announce it to the world that this is up there for review. And I think most courts do go through that process.
Yes, they would be, as far as the second comment is concerned, the guidelines are already available, which were developed earlier, but the code would be available soon as well. So it would be open for, it's not a closed document. But the first thing is very interesting. The lady who gave you the mic is working on exactly that thing in her PhD. So the idea is to take this thing beyond the code, and what we are working is there is a process called Charette process, which is a French word, in which you need to take on, because I know Dr. Shahid Alam is there, performance-based design ke concept hai, sir. Performance-based design is always start with the stakeholders, right? Just like that in energy efficiency and design, there's a concept of Charette process. The Charette process runs with these kind of things where the stakeholders sit together and come up with. That Charette process even is done in the fancy boardrooms of Marriott hotel. But that is not what would come up with a good design. So what we are doing is to incorporate, number one, that Charette process into a virtual reality environment, so that the stakeholders do not discuss something on paper rather than in a already built virtual structure or infrastructure or environment, and do the Charette process there. Second, it sounds simple, but it has to have a technical methodology. The second thing is the guidebook. You are saying it as something like other name, but the guidebook is a concept. So what we are doing is to take this thing beyond the code, incorporate the code. One thing that I missed to inform you, that those 9 or 10 codal requirements in existing houses have been physically implemented on selected houses, and their monitoring is underway for the effectiveness of the codes. And being at NAD, it's easy to incorporate those into our residential colony and other houses as well. So one such implementation is at Dr. Sanghi's house. So you need to have good friends as well to do this kind of research. So what I've done is that we have incorporated certain improvements which were possible into those low-rise housing buildings, and we are remonitoring those with the sensor system. And once the remonitoring results, it would be validated what we call as through living lab concept. This living lab concept helps you when you are doing experimentation in a using environment or an operational environment. We call it in science as a living lab concept. The guidebook not only would have again the description, but the readily available designs of different types which you can pick up, incorporate your dimensions, and develop an energy efficient house. So this is what the idea is. So that I don't know if she would become afraid of it or happy of it, but this is what she is doing with me at NED, continuing with this research, and it would also incorporate the social dimension, as I said. So this would be made available to everybody as well once the document is ready. Sir. Not only that, we have monitored 100 houses, 100 more than 100 houses and buildings. Yeah. But his, and there are two others where we have implemented. सल में सर काम में लगे थे तो मैंने उनको भी जगह सारा नाम लेके सर माइक बेटा जी
Dr. Farooq, thank you for such a rich and lucid presentation. I learned immensely and I'm grateful to you. And I think you have pointed out a very serious problem that codes are complex, complicated and boring documents. Nobody wants to consult them. मुझे हिंदुस्तान में उनकी जो हाउसिंग अथॉरिटी है उनके साथ कुछ अर्सा काम करने का मौका मिला और उनका कोई प्रोजेक्ट था बड़ा सारा जिसके दो ऑब्जेक्टिव्स थे कि जो गरीब लोग हैं या लिमिटेड इनकम वाले जो लोग हैं उनके घरों में हीटिंग एंड लाइटिंग के बजट्स को कम किया जाए ताकि उनकी कॉस्ट ऑफ लिविंग कम हो, बिजली के बिल कम आए और हीटिंग के बिल कम आए, उसके भी और उसके भी. नाउ आई चेक दिस थिंग विद नया पाकिस्तान कपल ऑफ ईयर्स अगो और जब ब्रिगेडियर साहब वहाँ पे काम करते थे उन्होंने कहा जी नहीं नहीं उसके साथ हमारी कंस्ट्रक्शन कॉस्ट बहुत बढ़ जाती हैं. तो वी आर वर्किंग ऑन लो इनकम ग्रुप एंड मैंने वर्ल्ड बैंक की जगहों को मुख्तलिफ जगहों पर उनके प्रोडक्ट्स देखे तो वो तो कह रहे थे कि 3-4% कॉस्ट बढ़ती है, ठीक है, मगर दोनों के 60-80% जो है वो कॉस्ट कम आ जाती है. नाउ आई वांट टू गिव यू एग्जांपल फ्रॉम हिंदुस्तान जहाँ से मैंने स्टार्ट किया क्योंकि मेरा कंसर्न वो था कि आपकी प्रेजेंटेशन में मुझे एक बायस नज़र आता है विच इज़ नॉट इन फेवर ऑफ लो इनकम ग्रुप्स. हिंदुस्तान में ये हुआ कि उन्होंने कहा जी ये कोड बुक्स बड़ी कॉम्प्लेक्स हैं, पूरे वैल्यू चेन में लोगों की कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग की जाए. तो आई हैव सीन देयर मॉड्यूल्स जिन्होंने राज, मजदूर, मिस्त्री ऑल द वे यहाँ से शुरू करके बिल्कुल जो लो एंड पे आते हैं all the way to the architects and designers and engineers and approvals and government approval authorities and clerks, उन सारों की कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग की, उनके लिए अलग-अलग मॉड्यूल बने कि जो कोड है वो तो हर किसी की ज़ुबान पर नहीं आ सकता मगर मजदूर और मिस्त्री को जो पता चल जाता है वो अगली जनरेशन तक भी चले जाता है. So my question is against this background, can you tell us if there is any effort to create a pro-poor bias in developing and implementing codes in formal and informal housing, gated and non-gated communities in both residential and commercial contexts? Thank you.
So what you are talking about is the detailed description or construction process and the human resource capacity of that. That would come after, once we have this, for example, this kind of code available, then what Fahim Saab was referring to, certain template designs available, and then only we can ask them. Because if I try to develop, although there have been some examples specifically in case of earthquake resistant houses where we do have the books and codes available, even developed by NED in collaboration with NDMA. Okay, I think it was about Avran earthquake, if I remember correctly, where they did have developed that and this was in the local language in Urdu as well, where all these stakeholders were trained even at the site, at the NAD, at the NDMA, to develop kind of earthquake resistant houses as they call it. But when it comes to the general housing sector, first we need to have those, what Fahim Saab has referred to, the templates available for different designs. And then we can have the template bracketed efforts like this, which you call it. So that would come, because that is the decision. Other than that, when you refer to India, they have done a lot of work on code. But correct me if I'm wrong, that have also been just changing the codal numbers and requirement in most of the cases, not in typically not, but again when it, because we are having the same kind of background, maybe they have worked more. But then again, when I look at different codes, when I used to look at now, for example, design codes, it was British standard to be specific, change into Indian standard at that time. Now, the training of the same is very essential part of them, but we need to realize who needs to be trained at first. At first, the designs need to be modified to those requirements. Once the designs are modified, then of course the designer would have to force the labor and foreman and everyone to do it like the same manner, and that would come at the tertiary end. So there is or you can say primary. So there are 3 levels to that. So that would come also with the advent of the things. Yes, I can hear you, I can repeat.
I guess your lack of presentation meant that we actually listened to you more than looking at the
I think it was better. Because in presentation I would restricted myself to what.
Just 2 questions and I'll be very straight and precise. एक तो ये था कि you talked about low height and communities, housing communities. लेकिन अगर हम projects को commercial sense में देखें तो they are more inclined towards maybe selling their projects. अगर हम housing से और low height से बाहर निकलें, so the clients that we talk to usually are interested in selling their projects. So they are more geared towards the US LEED certification और अब पाकिस्तान ग्रीन बिल्डिंग काउंसिल की जो सर्टिफिकेशन है. फिर दूसरा प्रोजेक्ट्स का चैलेंज होता है फंडिंग. इफ़ यू लुक एट दैट तो IFC की एज सर्टिफिकेशन है जिससे उनकी एक्चुअली फंडिंग नीड्स पूरी होती हैं. मेरा सवाल ये था कि डज दिस कोड विल बी गियर्ड, हैज़ दैट बीन स्टडीड, ताकि अगर लोग इस कोड को अडॉप्ट करें या कोड की चूँकि लेजिस्लेचर वैल्यू होगी तो उनको करना पड़ेगा, will that get them towards these certifications and funding from the IFC and so forth? और दूसरा सवाल is कि what's the timeline of this code? Where do we see it implemented? Thank you.
The first thing is, when it comes to code, the codes are there to be followed. Usually they do not relate to, at the end of the day, कि अगर आपने code समझा तो this certification would be granted to you. Even in US, if you talk about US GBC and LEED, it's not mandated, it's voluntarily. It primarily started with green globes, which was transformed into LEED, where the owners are interested in getting their, what we call as climate currency or green currency into their project, where they do market their projects as LEED certified, and also they want to make it willingly green building as well. Yes, in the policy document, that is policy implementation document, there is a reference to couple of these aspects. That number one, there have been definition or the recommendation for policy implementation where it is been referred that how to get these things audited. So for some things, the authorities have been identified. For few things, independent auditors have been identified to audit few aspects. So wherever the authority was present, the authority has been referred. The second thing is that these are GBC provisions for housing, and they are with currently EU and MOCC, and NAFTA was already there, so these would be made available. As far as the Pakistan Green Building Code is concerned, this is under which would incorporate all scales of buildings. It is under preparation, and I think Dr. Lodi mentioned it is to be finalized within this year, or maybe there might be a little bit delay with respect to that, but it is supposed to be final. The committee is supposed to be finalizing it by the end of this year, because this exercise, the provisions would be available soon through EU platforms and MOCC. The guidelines which were developed in last year, I think June, are available. Even in this, we have different agencies who have including UN Habitat and all those agencies who have worked with us to develop this. So this would be available sooner or later, definitely within this month, within this year, sorry. That's what I'm saying. Within this month was November, so they should ask me tomorrow. December, by because this is under review, I think it goes to different agencies in EU and then it would be made available. No, it would be probably, it is under there, but it would probably be superimposed by the Green Building Code of Pakistan because it would always have energy efficiency aspect incorporated into that. Ji, Miss, if we have time, otherwise.
Thank you. I think I agree this was really, insightful in terms of listening to all the good work NED has done. I have a question about, there is a building code of Pakistan and that was recently, if I remember 2021 or so, it was reviewed. Now it's again going through that incorporation of the green.
No, this would be a separate provisions, or you can say the document of green building dimension of that.
Yeah. So my question is related to that because when somebody says we are developing the code, so for non-engineers like us who are practitioners, we get so much confused about again code and code. So I know you are working on the Naya Pakistan, this housing scheme, housing code. Will that code apply to the mountainous regions, or do we need to, come up with a different code for that?
It does cover minimum aspects of different terrains, which could be realistically implemented, but specifically with respect to climate zones. So thank you very much. If you want to discuss more, I will.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farooq Arif. Dr. Farooq Arif explained the Green Building Code development process. He shared his valuable insights regarding the draft preparation, multi-stakeholder consultative workshop for validation and implementation plan for the code. He emphasized that the code development process should have experimental basis rather than mere adaptation of international codes. Our next presenter is Mr. Mohammad Tasi. He has wide international expertise in facilities management, sustainability, lead management, and construction management, as well as in MEP utilities and infrastructure management. Moreover, he had a long pioneering path as a freelance consultant, education lecturer, professional trainer, and public speaker, mainly on lead certification and sustainability management fields since 2006. He will present on sustainable integrated facilities management approach. Over to Mohammad Tasi Saab.
For hosting me. Can you hear me? Just I want to make sure that my voice is heard. Yes, excellent. I hear somebody. I'm sorry that I couldn't attend in person this time. Hopefully in the future I'll be with you. So today our presentation will be, let me share it with you. I hope it's gonna show up on the screen soon. Okay. So, good afternoon again, everybody. And here is my presentation. Can you see it? I think you can see it, right?
Yes, it's visible.
Yes. Thank you so much. So as an outline for today, I'll start with some very quick global warming moment, typical FM disciplines, integrative FM approach, green FM, facility life cycle assessment, innovative operational and commercial model, and we'll have some conclusion on this session. I'd like to highlight that this session is not a technical session, I would say, though it has some technicalities, but mainly it is an eye-opener on how we can do proper handling of our facilities in terms of facilities management, maintenance, in an integrative manner and in a sustainable green manner. At first, let me just clarify this disclaimer that all the presented materials, ideas, and pictures in this presentation are intended only for clarity and personal opinions rather than any advertising, promoting, or demoting purposes. Global warming is a fact, and the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere is rising continuously. Now we are at a dangerous point of 415.78 ppms. This is like just last month, and this number is unfortunately rising continuously without any serious controls to control it. This is causing severe disasters, natural disasters everywhere, and I'm sure you guys know most about it, especially in the last unfortunate like floods and climatic issues that you're facing in your country and in the surrounding area. Eventually, we should be careful that this is also affecting other parts of the world, not just in terms of higher temperatures, but also in other severe, like cold or changes in the climate. So in different aspects, whether it is tornadoes, temperatures, floods, droughts, all that stuff. So global warming, it's really impacting us heavily. And it is part of the impacts are like there's gonna be climatic change, and this is inevitable. We're gonna have unpredictable climate trends with severe weather changes. We're gonna have massive human migrations, and it's already happening due to storms, floods, fresh water, droughts, food issues, pollution issues, wars everywhere. So this is happening and unfortunately might happen more. And this will cause also further major losses in humans, in financial aspects, in materials, and on the environment. So this is happening. It is happening, and currently at an accelerated pattern. Now let's move deeper into our core topic in facilities management. So ISO 41001 2018 states that facilities management integrates multiple disciplines in order to have an influence on the efficiency and productivity of economies, of societies, communities, and organizations, as well as the manner in which individuals, ourselves, humans, are interacting or interact with the built environment. FM affects the health, well-being, and the quality of life of much of the world's societies and populations through the services it manages and delivers. I think this is somehow a very good definition of how facility management could affect our individual and community lives at a much larger scale. Let's here just have a look at what are the typical FM services and disciplines. Eventually, there could be unlimited number of services, and disciplines that could be covered by facilities management. Eventually, all non-core business services in any organization could be put under the term of facilities management. So whatever your organization is, or that company or organization deal with, it has a certain core business. Everything else that's not core business could be immediately merged and put all together under the facility management. Now, when we talk about integrative FM approach, we mean here it is a synergetic optimization of all these FM services and disciplines to reach some optimized, effective, efficient, and sustainable operations. Such integration requires dedicated professional teams, and obviously these teams should be having complementary expertise. It requires long-term planning, so we cannot plan like just for a short period and have short-term contracts and then expect high optimization and integration. No, we need long-term planning, long-term contracts, long-term thinking, long-term strategies. And we need to optimize our resource allocations. So it's not just adding numbers or putting like allocations wherever we need. No, it is something that needs to be optimized, very well thought about, and the right person in the right place. It is a performance-based subject, so it requires performance-driven structure. So the structure of the organization should also be built accordingly. Obviously, it requires robust quality management system to assure that the quality is done at the appropriate level and to assure the continuity of the service in the proper quality and under the proper quality standards and controls. And certainly at the end, it would require tailored operational and commercial model for that management system to cater for the right services that you are looking after. Now, if we move a bit to take the other side of it, which we call sustainable or green. So when we deal with the green FM, obviously we should base our concepts and understanding on the green design, which is the basis for high performance building. So accordingly, the green FM or the sustainable FM operation requires effective implementation of green concepts, whether they are related to the design or just related to the operations that we are running on the ground. So green FM covers mainly, or the main areas that are covered under it are 5 main areas, the 5 main pillars of any green design or green practice, which are usually sustainable sites, how we're dealing with the site that we are on, water management from all perspectives, whether it is potable, non-potable, is it for irrigation or for process use, is it for treatment, sewage treatment, all that stuff. Energy performance from all aspects again, including even the carbon emissions of our site, including commissioning, including renewables. Material handling, what type of materials we are using in our operation. Are these materials harmful for the atmosphere? Are they harmful for earth? Are they maybe some very precious materials? Or are they recycled materials? What recycled content? Regional materials and similar. And I would say a very important factor here is the indoor environmental quality. Because we want to care for ourselves, for our users, for our occupants, and those people are the most precious part of our operation. So indoor environmental quality includes like fresh air, includes filtration of air, includes smells, includes daylight, views, and everything that's related to the proper well-being and safety of our occupants. Now, the main objectives in this regard are conservation of resources, environmental stewardship for our operation and for our organization,